The air in the courtroom hung thick and heavy, a suffocating stillness that pressed against every soul present, as if the very walls were inching closer with each passing second. The officer stood tall at the center of it all, his pristine uniform stretched taut over his broad frame, every crease sharp enough to cut through the tension. His posture was unyielding, a monument of rigid defiance, exuding an arrogance so palpable it seemed to radiate from him like heat off asphalt in the summer sun. His eyes, glacial, unrepentant, bore into the woman seated behind the judge's bench, a piercing stare that carried not just disrespect, but a silent, seething refusal to acknowledge her right to be there. To him, her authority was a fiction, a flimsy construct he could dismantle with a sneer. This wasn't merely a challenge to the law, it was personal, a direct assault on her very existence in that chair. He wasn't just standing there, he was towering over an invisible line he'd drawn in his mind, daring her to cross it. She'd seen that look before, too many times to count. It was the smug glint of a man who'd spent decades cocooned in the belief that he was untouchable, a king in his own warped kingdom where accountability was a myth. He was the kind of man who strode into any room, be it a precinct, a bar, or a courtroom, and expected the world to bend, knees to buckle, voices to hush. His whole life had been a parade of unchecked power, a march where no one had ever dared to step in his path and demand he answer for the wreckage he left behind. But today, in her courtroom, that parade was grinding to a halt. She squared her shoulders, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade, firm, unshaken. "Officer, take your seat." He didn't budge. Instead, a slow, mocking chuckle rumbled from his chest, his head shaking as if her words were the punchline to some private joke. Then, with a deliberate lean forward, he let his venom drip into the air, each syllable laced with malice. "I don't take orders from people like you." The room froze, the weight of his words crashing down like an anvil, their unspoken meaning, a jagged shard of prejudice cutting through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, breaths held, eyes darting between the two figures locked in this silent war. The tension was a living thing now, coiling tighter, ready to snap. But she didn't flinch. She'd danced this dance before, faced down men like him who thrived on intimidation, who saw her as a target rather than a force. She knew their playbook: provoke, belittle, dominate. And she'd long since decided she wouldn't be a pawn in their game. "This is a court of law," she said, her voice a steady flame, calm yet commanding, burning away the chill of his defiance. "You will sit down or you will be removed." His smirk widened, a predator baring its teeth, and he tossed back a taunt that rang with reckless bravado. "I'd love to see you try." Then, in a flash, it happened. Brutal, sudden, a thunderclap of violence that shattered the room's fragile stillness. His fist crashed into her face with a sickening force, snapping her head to the side. Gasps ripped through the air, a scream piercing the chaos as papers fluttered to the floor like startled birds. Spectators leapt to their feet, a wave of shock and outrage surging through them. The officer stepped back, chest heaving, his expression a twisted mask of triumph, as if he'd just righted some cosmic wrong, as if the blood now trickling from her lip was proof of his righteousness. She stumbled, her balance wavering for a heartbeat, but she didn't fall. No. She wouldn't give him that trophy, wouldn't let him savor the sight of her broken. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened, her hand rising to wipe the crimson smear from her mouth. Her eyes found his again, and in that moment, the room didn't see a victim. They saw a tempest gathering strength, a storm cloud swelling with fury. For the briefest second, his arrogance flickered, a crack in his armor. Perhaps he'd expected tears, a crumpled figure cowering under his blow. Maybe he thought she'd shatter, her resolve dissolving into the chaos he'd unleashed. But instead, she adjusted her robe with a quiet dignity, drew a deep breath that seemed to pull the very air into her command, and reached for the gavel. It wasn't a gesture to quiet the room. It was a declaration of war. "Officer!" she said, her voice ringing out, clear and sharp as a blade forged in fire. "You just assaulted a sitting judge in a court of law." The room held its breath, every eye locked on the scene unfolding. He took a step forward, his lips parting as if to spit another retort, but she raised a hand, and the bailiffs, two burly figures who'd been hovering at the edges, sprang into motion. "Arrest him!" For the first time since he'd swaggered into her courtroom, uncertainty shadowed his face. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers flexing as the bailiffs hesitated, exchanging wary glances. They knew him, had worked beside him, shared coffee and crude jokes in the precinct break room. He was one of their own, a brother in blue, and yet here he stood, teetering on the edge of a reckoning. He still clung to that old belief, that unshakable faith that the system would shield him, that they'd never dare lock steel around his wrists. Until they did. The first cuff clicked into place, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. His face contorted, disbelief twisting into rage as he thrashed against their grip. "You can't do this!" he snarled, his voice a raw, desperate hiss. "Do you know who I am?" She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering, piercing through the storm of his fury. "No," she said, her tone steady as granite. "But after today, everyone will." And with that, the scales tipped. The air shifted, the power he'd wielded like a club slipping through his fingers. The bailiffs tightened their hold, dragging him back as he spat curses, his bravado crumbling into something pitiful. Beyond the courtroom's oak doors, the morning sun spilled through the towering windows of the Atlanta courthouse, casting golden streaks across the marble floors. The grand hallways buzzed with the murmur of voices, the hurried tap of footsteps, the rustle of legal briefs clutched in trembling hands. This was a temple of justice, a beacon of order, or so it was meant to be. For Judge Aeon Williams, it was a battlefield, one she'd fought on for years. She'd clawed her way up through a system rigged with bias and doubt, a black woman who dared to claim a seat at the table. At 38, she was the youngest judge of her kind in the city, a title that brought both reverence and resentment in equal measure. She'd heard the whispers, too young, too bold, too unapologetic. But she'd also heard the praise, the fiercest, most brilliant mind to ever don the robe. Raised in the gritty heart of South Atlanta, Aeon had seen the law's double-edged sword up close. Her father, a mechanic with calloused hands and a quiet pride, had been wrongfully accused of theft when she was 12. She could still feel the knot in her stomach as she sat in that courtroom, her small fists balled tight, watching uniformed men treat his innocence like a nuisance. The public defender, overworked and indifferent, barely lifted a finger. That day, something ignited in her. A vow that she'd never again be helpless, that she'd wield the law like a shield and a sword. Law school had been a crucible, the scrutiny relentless, the expectations crushing. While others leaned on family names or old boy networks, Aeon had fought tooth and nail, graduating at the top of her class, acing the bar, and carving out a reputation as an attorney who took no prisoners. Now, as a judge, she wasn't here to play politics or placate egos. She was here to hold the line, to ensure justice wasn't just a word but a reckoning. And that, she knew, painted a target on her back. Across town, Officer Jonathan Bryant adjusted his badge in the cracked rearview mirror of his patrol car, the morning light glinting off the silver. After 12 years on the force, that badge wasn't just a symbol. It was his crown, a talisman of invincibility. He'd grown up in a world where power was the only currency that mattered, a lesson drilled into him by his father, a cop who'd ruled their small town like a petty dictator. "The law bends to you," his old man had said, "not the other way around." Bryant had taken that to heart, striding through life with a swagger that dared anyone to challenge him. To some, he was a guardian, a steadfast enforcer of order. To others, a growing chorus, he was a tyrant, a man who twisted his authority into a weapon. Complaints piled up like autumn leaves, excessive force, profiling, intimidation, but they never stuck. The Brotherhood always had his back. The system always turned a blind eye. Until now. Today was different. Today he'd been summoned to testify, dragged into the courtroom of Judge Ayan Williams, a name that set his teeth on edge. A black woman presiding over him? The thought gnawed at him, an affront to the natural order he'd built his life around. As he stepped into the courthouse, his boots echoing on the marble, he carried not just his badge but a simmering rage, a conviction that he'd put her in her place. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet see, was that this day would mark the unraveling of everything he'd believed himself to be. In that courtroom, as the gavel fell and the cuffs clicked, something larger than one man's downfall took root. Justice, long delayed, had found its voice, a reminder that power unchecked is a house of cards waiting to collapse. The bailiffs, once his allies, now stood as witnesses to his ruin. The spectators, breathless, saw not just a judge struck, but a system trembling on the brink of exposure. And Ayan, bloodied but unbowed, became more than a woman in a robe. She became a symbol of consequence, a testament that no one, not even a man cloaked in a badge, could escape the scales when they finally tipped. What happened that day was only the spark. The fire, the truth, was still to come, and it would burn hotter and fiercer than anyone could imagine. The moment Officer Bryant stepped into the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Heads swiveled in his direction, some offering curt nods of recognition, their eyes glinting with a reluctant respect, while others leaned closer to their neighbors, exchanging hushed whispers that buzzed like flies. He could feel the rumors swirling around him. Reckless, they called him. A man who danced too close to the edge, who thumbed his nose at boundaries. But Bryant didn't care. Let them talk. He strode through the polished halls with purpose, his chest puffed out, his boots striking the floor with a rhythm that declared he was untouchable. This wasn't just a courtroom to him, it was a stage, and he intended to remind every soul in it who truly held the reins of power. Inside, the air thickened with a tension so dense it pressed against the lungs of everyone present. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of onlookers, lawyers in crisp suits, clerks clutching their notepads, defendants shifting nervously, all of them waiting, holding their breath as Bryant took his place at the center of it all. His uniform was pristine, every crease sharp enough to cut, his posture radiating a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He lifted his chin and locked eyes with Judge Ayan as she settled into her seat behind the towering bench. Neither of them flinched. Her dark eyes bore into his, steady and unyielding, a silent challenge he met with a flicker of amusement. She spoke first, her voice slicing through the stillness like a blade, calm yet commanding. "Officer Bryant, please take the stand." He didn't move right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, a deliberate pause that hung heavy in the room. His gaze stayed fixed on her, testing her resolve, daring her to push him. Then, with a slow, almost theatrical deliberation, he stepped forward. The echo of his boots reverberated off the high ceilings, a steady thud, thud, thud that seemed to mock the solemnity of the space. When he finally reached the stand and sat, he didn't sit upright like a man humbled by the law. No! He leaned back, sprawling casually, his arms crossed over his broad chest, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. It was a message, loud and clear. He wasn't afraid of her. Not her title, not her gavel, not her courtroom. She could sit up there in her black robe, but to him, she was nothing. Ayan, though, was no stranger to this game. She'd seen it all before, the swagger, the defiance, the quiet disdain that men like Bryant carried in their bones. They didn't just question her authority. They loathed it, resented the very idea that someone like her, a woman perhaps, or someone they deemed unworthy, could hold sway over them. She didn't care if they liked her. She wasn't here for their approval. Adjusting her glasses with a subtle flick of her wrist, she met his smirk with a gaze as cold and piercing as winter steel. "Officer Bryant," she said, her tone unwavering, "you are aware that you are under oath?" He exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that carried a hint of derision, and gave a single, curt nod. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice rough, as if the word itself was a concession he resented making. Ayan didn't blink. "Then let's begin," she replied, her words crisp and final, setting the stage for what was to come. At first, the questioning unfolded with a kind of mechanical civility, routine inquiries, procedural checkboxes ticked off one by one. But as the minutes ticked by, Ayan's approach sharpened. Her questions grew precise, relentless, each one a carefully aimed arrow that pierced through the flimsy armor of his report. She dissected his account with surgical precision, exposing gaps, inconsistencies, moments where his version of events frayed at the edges. The smirk that had clung to Bryant's face began to falter, slipping like a mask knocked askew. She was unraveling him, piece by piece, and he could feel it, the eyes of the room on him, the whispers growing louder, the heat creeping up his neck. He wasn't just being questioned, he was being made to look small, foolish, a man caught in his own web of half-truths. His jaw tightened, the muscles twitching as his fingers drummed an impatient rhythm against the wooden armrest of the stand. The room watched, waiting, sensing the storm brewing beneath his skin. He needed to take back control, to stop her from stripping him bare in front of them all. Leaning forward just enough to close the distance, he lowered his voice, letting it drip with a venom that sent a chill through the air. "You know, Judge, it's funny," he said, his eyes narrowing. "People like you always think they're in control, but the second you step outside these walls, it's a different story, isn't it?" The words landed like a veiled threat, a dark promise that lingered in the silence that followed. The courtroom held its breath, the weight of his implication pressing down on every soul present. Ayan felt the heat of dozens of eyes boring into her, waiting to see how she'd react. Would she crumble, lash out, retreat? But she didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply held his gaze, her expression as steady as the stone walls around them. Then, with a calm that bordered on eerie, she spoke. "Officer Bryant, you will watch your tone in my courtroom." Something dark flickered across his face, a shadow of rage, a crack in the facade he'd spent years perfecting. For a moment, he held himself together, his breathing shallow, his knuckles whitening as they gripped the edge of the stand. And then, in an instant, everything shattered. He moved too fast for anyone to anticipate. 1 second he was seated, the next he was on his feet, his fist slicing through the air with a force that seemed to suck the sound from the room. The impact was thunderous, a sickening crack as his knuckles met Ayan's jaw. She reeled back, pain exploding across her face, a white-hot burst that radiated through her skull. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps ripped through the air, some onlookers leaping to their feet, others frozen in their seats, mouths agape. A woman in the back row screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the pandemonium. Clerks dropped their pens, attorneys scrambled, their whispers escalating into frantic shouts. Bryant stepped back, his chest heaving, his knuckles pale and streaked with red. For a fleeting moment, a glint of triumph flashed in his eyes. He'd done it. He'd struck her, put her in her place. But then he saw her move. Ayan straightened slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had bent to her will. A thin trickle of blood seeped from the corner of her mouth, staining her lips crimson, but she didn't wipe it away. She didn't wince. She just stared at him, her face unreadable, her eyes burning with a quiet, unshakable intensity. And then, impossibly, she smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips that sent a shiver down Bryant's spine. His confidence crumbled, the smug satisfaction draining from his features as the room held its breath. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and laced with a certainty that cut deeper than any blow he could land. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, as the reality of what he'd done crashed down around him. Bryant had spent his entire career, his entire life, believing he was above the law, a man who could bend it, break it, wield it like a club without ever facing the consequences. But today, that illusion was about to shatter. The room remained frozen, the air itself seeming to tighten, suffocating everyone with the enormity of the moment. A judge, a sitting judge, had been struck in her own courtroom, in full view of attorneys, clerks, defendants, and jurors. It was an act so unthinkable, so brazen, that it tore at the very fabric of justice, exposing the raw, jagged truth beneath. Power, unchecked, could rot into something monstrous. Ayan's cheek throbbed, the pain pulsing in time with her heartbeat, but she barely registered it. She'd endured worse, blows that didn't leave visible marks but had carved deep scars into her soul. This was nothing. What mattered wasn't the sting of her skin or the blood on her lips. What mattered was what came next. She could see it in Bryant's eyes, the wild, feral glint that flickered there, the slow realization creeping in behind his bravado. He smirked again, a sluggish, self-satisfied grin that made her blood boil. But she held herself steady, her fury a controlled flame. The courtroom teetered on the brink of anarchy. The bailiffs stood rigid, their hands hovering near their belts, caught in a paralyzing hesitation. Duty warred with instinct, their loyalty split between the law they swore to uphold and the man they'd worked beside for years. Attorneys murmured in urgent, overlapping voices, their eyes darting between Ayan and Bryant, waiting for the next move. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys, trembling slightly, as if afraid to commit the moment to record. And then there were the other officers, Bryant's brothers in blue, lined along the back wall, their faces unreadable, but their postures taut, coiled, watching not with horror but with a quiet, simmering tension. They weren't worried about her. They were worried about him. Ayan exhaled slowly, forcing the fire in her chest to settle, her voice as firm as the gavel resting beside her. "You think you can walk away from this?" It wasn't a question. It was a truth, cold and unassailable, because that's exactly what Bryant believed. His smirk widened, a low chuckle rolling from his throat, dark and menacing as it echoed through the room. "I don't think, Judge," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "I know." That was him in a nutshell. Years of crossing lines, twisting rules, swinging his badge like a sledgehammer, and never once paying the price. Until now. Ayan took a step forward, and the shift was instantaneous. The whispers stopped. The bailiffs stiffened. The air itself seemed to still, as if the room understood that this was no longer Bryant's game. Before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence, sharp, commanding, edged with something that made her pause. Judge Williams. It was the chief bailiff, a man she'd known for years, a steady presence she'd always trusted. But now, there was a warning in his tone, a subtle shift that made her turn her head. Their eyes met, and in that split second, she saw it. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, at the officers lining the room, at Bryant's comrades. They weren't stunned by what he'd done. They weren't outraged. They stood there, hands resting lightly on their belts, eyes narrowed, waiting to see if they needed to intervene. Not for her, but for him. The realization hit her like a blade, sharp and cold. They didn't care that he'd struck her. They cared what she might do about it. For a long moment, Ayan said nothing. She let the weight of it settle over her, the bitter truth sinking into her bones. She could feel every gaze in the room, hot and probing, waiting for her to crack, to falter, to prove them right. She'd spent her life playing by the rules, rules that had never shielded her, never spared her from the bruises of a world that didn't want her to rise. And Bryant, he knew that. That's why he'd hit her. That's why he smirked. The rules weren't built to hold men like him accountable. They were built to protect them. She took another breath, slow and measured, her heartbeat steadying as she turned back to him. "You just assaulted a sitting judge," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with a calm so lethal it made the air tremble. The lesson here wasn't just about his downfall. It was about justice, raw and unyielding, rising from the ashes of his arrogance. Bryant had abused his power, believing it made him invincible, but in that moment, as Ayan stood unbroken, bloodied but unbowed, he learned the cost. power without consequence was a lie, and she was the truth come to claim him. In the stillness of the courtroom, Brian's voice cut through the air, smooth yet unyielding, like steel cloaked in velvet. His face remained a mask of unshaken confidence, and if anything, the faint smirk tugging at his lips only widened as he let the audacity of his earlier words linger. The sound of them had exploded into the room moments ago, sharp and piercing, like a gunshot reverberating off the polished wood and high ceilings. Ayanna, standing tall behind the bench, felt the weight of that moment settle deep into her bones. Her heart thudded steadily, but her mind was a storm of clarity. She knew exactly what she had to do, though not yet. She wouldn't let impatience guide her hand. This wasn't a rash decision born of anger. It was a reckoning years in the making. Bryant had spent his life swaggering through the world, cloaked in the belief that he was beyond reach, untouchable by the rules that bound others. Now, she would strip that illusion away, layer by arrogant layer, and make him feel the suffocating weight of his own actions, the consequences he'd danced around for far too long. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hurl accusations or pound her fist in a dramatic plea for justice that could be spun against her later. Instead, she turned her gaze to the chief bailiff, her eyes steady and piercing, and spoke with a calm that sent chills rippling through the room. "Clear the courtroom," she said, her voice unwavering, slicing through the murmurs like a blade. A wave of bewilderment washed over the space. Attorneys froze mid-conversation, exchanging quick, uncertain glances. Reporters, clutching their notepads like lifelines, tightened their grips, their pencils hovering over half-formed sentences. Even the bailiffs, seasoned men who'd seen their share of chaos, hesitated, their boots scuffing the floor as they shifted their weight. Bryant, lounging in his arrogance, let out a low, mocking chuckle, the sound dripping with condescension. "Scared, Judge?" he taunted, his tone daring her to flinch. Ayanna didn't so much as blink. "I said," she repeated, her voice a quiet thunder, "clear the courtroom." The chief bailiff, a burly man with graying hair and a face weathered by decades of upholding order, swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed as he processed the command, then he gave a curt nod. Turning to the room, he raised a hand, motioning for everyone to move. One by one, they obeyed, slowly, reluctantly. A young clerk stumbled over her own feet, her arms full of files she clutched protectively. A reporter in a rumpled suit lingered near the door, craning his neck for one last look. Some cast furtive glances over their shoulders as they shuffled out, their eyes darting between Ayanna's unflinching resolve and Bryant's smirking defiance. Sensing the air thickening with the promise of something monumental, Bryant watched it all unfold, his amusement flickering like a candle in the wind. At first, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if this were just another performance he'd seen a dozen times before. But as the room emptied, as the heavy oak doors thudded shut behind the last straggler, a shadow of confusion crept into his expression. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He'd expected her to explode, tears streaming down her face, voice cracking with rage, giving him something to twist and mock. Instead, she stood there, silent and deliberate, her presence a quiet force that unnerved him more than any outburst could. Minutes stretched on, the ticking of the wall clock growing louder in the hollow space. The courtroom, once buzzing with life, was now a tomb, its vastness reduced to just them. Ayanna, Bryant, the chief bailiff, and a handful of officers still rooted to their spots, their breaths shallow as they waited for her next move. Ayanna exhaled slowly, the sound soft but commanding, and lifted her chin. Every inch of her radiated authority, a woman who'd spent years honing her strength in the face of men like him. With measured precision, she reached for her gavel, her fingers brushing the smooth wood as if it were an extension of her will. Bryant's smirk returned, but this time it faltered, a nervous edge glinting beneath it. For the first time in years, maybe ever, he couldn't predict what came next. The control he'd wielded like a weapon slipped through his fingers, and a flicker of fear danced in his dark eyes. Ayanna tapped the gavel once, the sound crisp and deliberate, echoing through the room like a judge's final decree. Then she spoke, her voice steady as stone. "Officer Bryant," she said, pausing just long enough to let the weight of his name hang in the air, "you are under arrest." The silence that followed was deafening, a void so thick it seemed to swallow the room whole. But what came next was beyond anyone's imagination. Ayanna's words didn't just fill the space. They crushed it, pressing down on every soul present until the air felt too heavy to breathe. Time slowed, each second stretching into an eternity, the gravity of the moment sinking into the marrow of everyone there. The courtroom, with its towering ceilings and rows of empty benches, suddenly felt claustrophobic, as if the walls had crept inward to bear witness to Bryant's unraveling. No one dared move. The chief bailiff, a man who'd faced down armed felons without blinking, stood with his mouth slightly agape, words caught in his throat like a fish on a hook. The officers flanking him went rigid, their hands twitching at their sides, fingers brushing the edges of their holsters as they grappled with what they'd just seen and what might follow. In the periphery, the stragglers, attorneys with their briefcases half open, clerks clutching stacks of papers, reporters scribbling furiously, froze like statues, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding at the room's heart. And there, in the center of it all, stood Jonathan Bryant, the smug, untouchable officer who'd spent years bending the law to his whims, who'd just crossed an unthinkable line by striking a sitting judge in her own domain. His fist still hung at his side, knuckles white from clenching, his body trembling with the remnants of his earlier fury. But now, something new flickered across his face, disbelief. His lips parted, breath hitching as his eyes darted around the room, searching for an anchor, a lifeline, anything to tell him this wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Surely someone, anyone, would step in, laugh it off, remind Ayanna that her words were powerless against him. That's how it had always been. Complaints filed, witnesses silenced, suspensions shrugged off like dust. He'd walked away every time, unscathed, because men like him didn't fall. But this time the air was different, colder, heavier, pressing in on him like a vice. He let out a short, jagged laugh, shaking his head as if he could dismiss it all with a flick of his wrist. "You're kidding," he muttered, his voice sharp but unsteady, a man trying to convince himself as much as the room. Ayanna didn't flinch, didn't waver, her gaze locked on him like a predator sizing up its prey. Bryant's breath came harder, ragged now. "This is a joke," he said again, louder, the first threads of panic weaving into his tone. He spun around, scanning the faces of the officers, his brothers in blue, the men who'd always had his back. "You can't seriously be going along with this," he snapped, his voice rising. "She's making a scene. She's trying to humiliate me. You all see what this is, right?" Silence. Not a single step. Not a word. The officers who'd once stood shoulder to shoulder with him, who'd laughed off his excesses and covered his tracks, now hesitated. Their eyes flickered, some to Ayanna, some to the floor, uncertain for the first time in his career. And that hesitation, that tiny crack in their loyalty, hit him like a sledgehammer. A shadow passed over his face, something raw and ugly twisting his features into a mask of barely contained rage. He turned back to Ayanna, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You think you can do this?" he hissed, his voice low and sharp, a warning laced with venom. She didn't blink. "I already did," she replied, her tone as calm as a still lake, but with depths that promised a storm. Bryant's body stiffened, his breath catching in his chest. For a fleeting moment, she saw it, the fracture in his armor, the tremor in his composure he fought so hard to hide. He tried to claw back control, to rebuild the wall of arrogance that had always shielded him, but it was crumbling too fast. The chief bailiff took a single step forward, the sound of his boot against the floor like a spark igniting dry tinder. It shattered the tension, making the moment feel achingly, devastatingly real. "Officer Bryant," Ayanna said again, her voice ringing with unshakable authority, "you are under arrest for the assault of a sitting judge in a court of law." The words landed like blows, each one driving the truth deeper into him. His jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might shatter, his nostrils flaring as his body locked in defiance. He fought it, the reality crashing down around him, but there was no escaping it now. "You don't know what you're doing," he growled, his voice tight, barely more than a snarl. Ayanna stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her presence towering despite her steady calm. "You assaulted me in front of an entire courtroom," she said, her words deliberate, unflinching. "In front of officers, in front of cameras. Do you really think there's a way out of this?" His chest heaved, sharp and uneven, his breaths coming in bursts. "You don't get it," he spat, his voice trembling with a dangerous certainty. "You think the law's on your side? You think any of this matters?" He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "People like you don't win against people like me." Ayanna tilted her head, a faint, knowing glint in her eyes. "And yet," she said softly, "here we are." His fingers twitched, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, she saw it, the instinct flickering in his gaze, the wild thought that maybe, just maybe, he could reach for his gun and erase this all. It was a desperate, fleeting impulse, the last gasp of a man who'd always solved his problems with force. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She stood her ground, her silence a wall he couldn't breach, and slowly, painfully, he backed down. His hand uncurled, his shoulders slumped just a fraction, but the rage, the hatred, still burned in his eyes, a fire that promised this wasn't over. The lesson here wasn't just Bryant's fall, it was the shattering of a myth. Power, when abused, builds a fragile throne, and justice, though slow, is an unrelenting force. For every officer who'd turned a blind eye, for every citizen he'd silenced, this moment was a mirror held up to their complicity. And for Ayanna, it was a testament to the strength found in restraint, in wielding authority not as a weapon, but as a shield for what was right. The courtroom, now a quiet battlefield, bore witness to the truth. No one, not even the untouchable, could outrun the consequences forever. Beneath the polished veneer of the courtroom, a storm of fury simmered, barely contained. The chief bailiff, a stern figure with weathered hands that had seen countless dramas unfold, extended one of those hands toward Jonathan Bryant, a silent, unyielding demand that carried the weight of inevitability. Bryant stood rigid, his lips pressed into a thin, trembling line, his face a mask of stone. Once a fortress of arrogance, that mask now hid a torrent of emotions he refused to let spill: dread, defiance, and the faint flicker of disbelief that this could be happening to him. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto some distant point, as if by sheer will he could block out the reality closing in like a vice. Then, with a slowness that betrayed his inner turmoil, he reached for the badge pinned to his chest, the gleaming symbol of his authority, his identity, his untouchable status. His fingers hovered there, trembling for a heartbeat, suspended in a moment of agonizing hesitation. And then, with a sudden, jagged motion fueled by raw defiance, he tore it free and hurled it to the ground. The sharp clatter of metal against tile reverberated through the hushed courtroom, a sound that seemed to linger longer than it should, a bitter, resounding note of surrender to a world that refused to bend to his will this time. But the story didn't end there. Not yet. As Bryant stood stripped bare, no longer cloaked in the armor of his badge, no longer the towering figure he'd built himself to be, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom groaned open. Beyond them waited a chaotic sea of flashing cameras and clamoring voices. The press had descended like vultures, their lenses glinting in the dim light, their shouted questions slicing through the air like blades. "Officer Bryant, do you have a statement? What led to this moment? Is it true about your record?" The world had come crashing in, and what had begun as a courtroom scandal was now exploding into a national spectacle. Bryant's face twisted in a visceral mix of horror and rage as the chief bailiff seized his wrists with a grip as unyielding as fate itself. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around his skin. The metallic click, a final punctuation mark on his fall. The weight of every choice he'd ever made, every abuse of power, every moment he'd sneered at accountability, pressed down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. Jonathan Bryant, the great untouchable officer who had spent decades strutting through life convinced the law was his to wield, was now nothing more than a man in chains, a mugshot in the making. Across the room, Ayanna stood still, her presence a quiet storm of resolve. She didn't cheer or smirk. She didn't need to. Her dark eyes, steady and piercing, followed Bryant's every move, drinking in the scene she'd waited years to witness. This wasn't a moment of triumph for her to dance in. It was something deeper, something colder. Justice, raw and unadorned, was unfolding before her, and she savored its bitter taste. She'd spent countless nights replaying the humiliations, the threats, the times he'd loomed over her life like a shadow she couldn't shake. Now, as the handcuffs locked tight and the courtroom held its breath, she felt the scales tipping, not with fanfare but with the quiet certainty of consequence. Bryant barely registered the cuffs at first. His jaw clenched so hard it might have cracked, his nostrils flaring with each ragged breath. His face remained a fortress of disbelief, as if his mind couldn't or wouldn't accept the collapse of the world he'd built. He'd spent his entire career believing this day was impossible, that he was a titan above the rules, shielded by favors and loopholes and the loyalty of those who feared him. But now, as the clamor of the press grew louder beyond the doors, as the weight of every camera lens bore into him like 1,000 accusing eyes, the truth clawed its way through his denial. There was no escape. The chief bailiff's hand tightened on his arm, guiding him toward the exit with the steady force of a man who'd seen this dance before. Bryant resisted, digging his heels into the floor just shy of the threshold, his chest heaving unevenly, his fingers twitching at his sides as his mind raced for a lifeline. Some trick, some threat, some remnant of the power he'd once wielded so effortlessly. Then, something snapped. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, just loud enough for Ayanna to catch. His words dripped with a fury so pure it seemed to burn the air between them. "You think you've won? You think they'll let this stand?" His lips curled into a sneer, his body taut with rage, his chest rising and falling like a bellows stoking a dying fire. "You don't get it, Judge. You never did." Ayanna didn't flinch. She stood like a pillar, her gaze unwavering, her silence a weapon sharper than any retort. That stillness infuriated him more than words ever could. "I know people," he spat, his voice dropping into a desperate, quivering snarl. "You think the DA's going to let this slide? You think the department's just going to sit there and watch one of their own go down because of—" He stopped himself, but the unspoken word hung heavy in the air, a dagger he didn't dare unsheathe. Ayanna knew what he'd meant to say. He did too. The silence stretched taut between them, a razor's edge waiting to slice. When Ayanna finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried the weight of iron. "One of their own?" She let the phrase linger, watching as Bryant's throat bobbed, his carefully constructed facade cracking at the seams. "And what does that mean, Officer Bryant?" He had no answer, none he could voice, because they both understood the truth. His entire career had been a house of cards built on protection, on the unspoken pact that no matter how far he pushed, someone would always sweep the mess away. Until today. Ayanna took a deliberate step closer, narrowing the distance just enough that her words pressed into him like a physical force. "You walked into this courtroom believing you were untouchable," she said, her tone deceptively calm, though beneath it simmered a razor-sharp edge. "You struck a sitting judge, me, in front of witnesses, in front of officers on camera. And yet you still think you can walk away?" She tilted her head, her eyes boring into his. "Tell me, Bryant, what does it feel like to lose?" That question broke something in him. His body lurched forward, a primal instinct to lash out, to reclaim control, but the chief bailiff's grip yanked him back with a force that made him stumble. His breathing turned harsh, his pulse hammering visibly in his neck, his chest heaving as if he were trying to cage a beast within. "You don't get to do this to me!" he roared, his voice splintering, the last threads of his composure unraveling. "You think you're different? You think you matter? You're just a name they'll forget, a headline that'll fade." Ayanna stepped forward again, and this time, Bryant flinched back, a small, instinctive retreat he didn't even register. For the first time, he wasn't the predator. He was the prey, cornered and exposed. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, stripping away the last of his illusions. He wasn't in control. He wasn't feared. He was just a man in handcuffs, a criminal unmasked for the world to judge. Ayanna didn't revel in it. She didn't need to. This wasn't about her victory. It was about the slow, inexorable grind of justice, about the lesson that power misused carries a price. The courtroom doors burst open again, and the blinding flash of cameras flooded the space. Bryant tensed, his breath catching as the relentless storm of reporters surged forward. "Officer Bryant, what's your statement?" "Judge Williams, how do you feel about this arrest? Is it true you've got a history of excessive force?" The questions pummeled him, overlapping in a merciless cacophony. Then came the killing blow. An intern from a major network uploaded the raw footage, unfiltered, undeniable, of Bryant striking Ayanna in the courtroom. Within seconds, it spread like wildfire across screens, phones, and televisions nationwide. Millions of eyes watched, judged, condemned. Bryant's destruction unfolded in real time, and he could do nothing but stand there, shackled and powerless as the empire he'd built crumbled. The DA's office issued a scathing statement within minutes, denouncing his actions. The mayor distanced himself with cold efficiency. Even Bryant's own department released a terse promise of investigation. But the words rang hollow, a formality laced with abandonment. For the first time, Bryant felt the sting of the system he'd manipulated for years turn against him. He felt the helplessness, the isolation, the gut-wrenching truth that power wasn't eternal, that even the untouchable could fall. He'd spent his life believing consequences were for others. Now the world watched him pay the price. Ayanna lingered at the top of the courthouse steps, her silhouette framed against the gray sky as Bryant was shoved into a squad car. His head ducked low, his face unreadable once more, a shadow of the man he'd been. For a fleeting moment, she thought he might say something, a final snarl, a last gasp of defiance. But the car door slammed shut, cutting off any chance of words. The engine roared to life, and he was gone. Or so it seemed. But the echoes of this day would linger. What happens when a man who's lived as if he's invincible finally shatters? What happens when the allies who once propped him up turn their backs? For Bryant, the lesson was clear, etched in the cold steel of handcuffs and the unrelenting glare of justice. Power abused is power lost, and no one, not even the untouchable, can outrun the consequences forever. The air in the courthouse was thick with tension, a palpable electricity that seemed to hum through the walls as the echoes of Bryant's defiance lingered. He hadn't gone down without a struggle, his fists clenched, his voice a raw growl of resistance until the very moment the cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. But even as the scuffle ended, the real storm was only just beginning to brew. By the time the dust settled, a grainy video of his arrest had already ignited the digital landscape, racing across every social media platform like wildfire. Newsrooms buzzed with fervor, reporters hunched over desks, dissecting each blurry frame as if it held the secrets of the universe. Political pundits filled the airwaves with grand pronouncements, their voices rising and falling in a cacophony of debate about what it all meant. Power, privilege, justice. On X and beyond, the reaction was a chaotic inferno. Some cheered with a fierce, almost primal satisfaction, while others seethed with outrage, their words dripping with venom as they mourned the fall of a man they'd once deemed untouchable. The image of Bryant, His uniform wrinkled, his face twisted in a mix of shock and fury as he was hauled out of the courthouse he'd swaggered through for years, was seared into the collective mind of a nation. It was a scene that spoke volumes, a stark reminder that even the mightiest could tumble. Yet justice, as Ayanna Williams knew too well, was never a tidy affair. Stepping back into the shadowed halls of the courthouse, Ayanna felt the weight of the day settle over her like a heavy cloak. The clamor of the outside world pressed in, camera flashes bursting like lightning, reporters shouting questions that blurred into a relentless roar, their microphones thrust toward her as if she held all the answers. Her chest tightened under the strain, her breath shallow as she navigated the chaos. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The repercussions were still unfolding, spiraling outward in unpredictable waves, and she could feel the undertow pulling at her resolve. Inside the marble corridors of power, the machinery of influence was already grinding into motion. Behind polished wooden doors, men and women in crisp suits leaned over conference tables, their voices hushed but urgent. Phones buzzed incessantly, screens glowing with a flood of emails as the elite scrambled to recalibrate. This wasn't just about Bryant anymore. It was about the sprawling, tangled system that had cradled him for years, shielding him from accountability, until now. His fall had cracked that facade wide open, and the powers that be faced a stark choice: abandon him to the wolves or cling to him and risk sinking into the abyss alongside him. The lesson was clear. Abusing power came with a price, and justice, however messy, demanded its due. The first hint of trouble arrived barely an hour later, a sharp jolt that snapped Ayanna out of her fleeting moment of stillness. She sat alone in her chambers, the room dim save for the harsh glow of her laptop screen. Her hands pressed against the cool wood of her desk, fingers splayed as if anchoring herself against the storm she knew was coming. The news ticker scrolled relentlessly, each word a fresh stab. Bryant's lawyer issues statement. She leaned closer, her pulse quickening as the man's voice crackled through the speakers, smooth, rehearsed, dripping with defiance. Officer Bryant was unjustly arrested in a moment of heightened emotion, he declared, his tone laced with indignation. What we witnessed today was not justice but a miscarriage, fueled by political agendas and personal grudges. We will exhaust every legal avenue to ensure his rights are upheld. Ayanna's jaw tightened, her teeth grinding together as a slow burn of anger flared in her chest. They were already at it, spinning the tale, weaving a new narrative where Bryant wasn't the villain, but the victim, a martyr wronged by a vengeful system. The headlines followed like obedient soldiers. Officer Bryant breaks silence. I was targeted. Police union slams arrest, demands probe into Judge Williams. The audacity of it twisted her stomach, but she wasn't surprised. Men like Bryant didn't just accept defeat. They clawed their way back, armed with allies and a playbook honed by years of privilege. Her phone buzzed against the desk, a sharp vibration that made her flinch. One message, then another, then a deluge. Friends, colleagues, legal advisors, their words a mix of encouragement and unease. Stay strong, one read. This is getting ugly, warned another. But one stood out, stark and chilling in its brevity. They're coming for you. She let out a slow, measured breath, the air hissing through her teeth as the reality sank in. She'd known this was inevitable from the moment she'd given the order, from the second she'd watched the steel cuffs close around Bryant's wrists and seen the flicker of fear in his eyes, a fear he'd quickly masked with rage. Men like him didn't bow to consequences. They waged war against them, backed by a system that had bent over backward to protect them for far too long. And now that system was turning its gaze on her. By the next morning, the retaliation struck with surgical precision. A formal review of her conduct was announced, the news delivered with the cold formality of a press release. Anonymous sources, faceless, cowardly voices, began whispering to the media, their claims slithering into the public ear. She'd acted rashly, let emotion cloud her judgment, overstepped her authority. The police union roared louder, their demands for an investigation into her echoing through the city like a battle cry. The mayor's office released a statement, its words carefully crafted to sound neutral, yet dripping with implication. "We are committed to a fair and just process." The governor, meanwhile, remained conspicuously silent, his absence speaking louder than any speech. Ayanna wasn't fooled. This wasn't about saving Bryant, it was about punishing her for daring to challenge the unspoken rules. They wanted her to feel the heat, to buckle under the pressure of their collective might. But as she sat at her desk, fingers steepled and eyes narrowed, her mind raced through every possibility, every move they might make, every trap they might set. Justice wasn't just a gavel strike, it was a battlefield, and she'd known that long before she'd taken the bench. A sharp knock broke her reverie. She glanced up, her assistant slipping into the room with a look that hovered between concern and dread.
"There's someone here to see you,"
the young woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna's spine straightened, her hands falling to her sides. "Who?" A pause, heavy with hesitation, then, "The district attorney." Ayanna exhaled slowly, setting down the pen she hadn't realized she'd been clutching so tightly her knuckles ached. The game was escalating, and she could feel the storm closing in. Rising from her chair, she smoothed her robe, her face settling into a mask of calm resolve. Without a word, she stepped out of her sanctuary and into the fray. The DA waited in the conference room, his arms crossed, his expression a calculated blend of neutrality and disdain. He was a politician first, a lawyer second, every gesture, every syllable designed for maximum impact. "Ayanna," he greeted, his voice clipped, professional, but edged with ice. "We have a problem." She didn't sit, didn't soften her stance. "No," she countered, her tone steady as steel. "Bryant has a problem. I upheld the law. If that's inconvenient for some, that's not my burden to carry." A muscle twitched in his jaw, a flicker of irritation breaking through his composure. "This is bigger than him now," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Do you see what's happening? The department's closing ranks. The union's threatening a walkout if this isn't handled appropriately." His voice dipped, a warning wrapped in velvet. "And there are people in this building who don't like a judge picking a fight with law enforcement." She didn't flinch, her gaze locking with his. "I'm not fighting law enforcement, I'm holding a criminal accountable. There's a difference." Silence stretched between them, thick and charged, until he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture of exasperation. "They're coming for you," he admitted finally, his tone grudging. "They want your recusal. If they can sow enough doubt, if they can make this look personal, they'll push you off the case." So that was their angle. If they couldn't erase Bryant's sins, they'd erase her instead. She let the thought settle, the weight of it pressing against her ribs until it crystallized into something sharp and clear. Then she smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips, devoid of warmth. "I'm not stepping down," she said simply. His eyes hardened, a flash of frustration breaking through. "You might not have a choice." She sat then, folding her hands with deliberate calm. "Let them come." His jaw tightened, a storm brewing behind his carefully controlled facade. "This isn't a game, Ayanna." She held his stare, unflinching. "No, it's a reckoning." Another silence, heavier this time. Then he stood, his movements abrupt. "I'll do what I can," he muttered, his voice low, almost reluctant. "But you need to watch your back." She watched him leave, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the stillness. For the first time, she let herself feel it. Not fear, not doubt, but a fierce, unshakable certainty. The system had shielded men like Bryant for decades, cloaking their abuses in silence and complicity. Now, forced to confront its own reflection, it lashed out. But if they thought they could break her, they were about to discover the strength of the woman they'd underestimated. The weight of it all bore down on her, a relentless pressure from every direction. Yet Ayanna had learned long ago to shoulder burdens that were never meant to be fair. The courthouse corridors, usually alive with the hum of footsteps and murmured conversations, had fallen eerily quiet, a deceptive calm masking the chaos beyond its walls. Outside, the world was ablaze, split between those who hailed Bryant's downfall as a triumph of justice and those who saw it as an assault on the very foundations they revered. Her office, once a refuge, felt suffocatingly small, the slanted light from the blinds casting jagged shadows across her desk. Her phone buzzed again and again, a chorus of warnings and pleas from allies too cautious to stand with her openly. She left it untouched, already anticipating their words. Another knock startled her from her thoughts. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion tugging at her edges, then straightened. "Come in," she called, her voice steady, despite the weariness creeping in. The door creaked open, and to her surprise, it wasn't another suit-clad official. It was Detective Marcus Hale, a tall, broad-shouldered black man whose presence filled the room without effort. A veteran of the force, he'd crossed her courtroom countless times, his demeanor quiet but resolute, his integrity a stark contrast to Bryant's arrogance. He stood in the doorway, his dark eyes meeting hers with a weight she couldn't quite decipher. Unlike Bryant, Marcus carried himself with a humility that belied his authority, a man who'd seen the system's flaws up close but never let them define him. "Judge Williams," he began, his voice low and gravelly, tinged with something like respect. Or was it concern? "I thought you should know what's coming." She tilted her head, curiosity piqued. "And what's that, Detective?" He hesitated, shifting his weight, then stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. "The union's not just talking walkouts. They're digging, looking for anything they can use against you. And Bryant, he's not done fighting. He's got people in his corner, people who don't care about the truth." His words hung heavy, a warning wrapped in solidarity. Ayanna studied him, noting the faint lines of fatigue etched into his face, the way his hands clenched briefly at his sides. Here was a man caught between loyalty to his badge and disgust at what it had come to shield. She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. "And where do you stand, Marcus?" He met her gaze, unflinching. "With the law," he said simply. "Not with him." A faint smile tugged at her lips, grateful, weary, but resolute. The battle lines were drawn, and the lesson was unmistakable. Power could corrupt, but it could also be challenged. And as the storm raged on, Ayanna knew she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a justice that refused to bend. The air in the room felt heavy as Marcus stood framed in the doorway, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the worn wooden floor. His brow furrowed, a storm of indecision swirling in his dark eyes. Ayanna sat behind her desk, her posture rigid yet composed, and with a subtle tilt of her hand, she motioned toward the chair across from her. For a heartbeat, Marcus wavered, his boots scuffing faintly against the threshold as though an invisible line held him back. Then, with a reluctant resolve, he crossed it, easing the door shut behind him with a soft click that echoed in the silence. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he stood there, his gaze sweeping over her, searching, probing, as if he could unearth some hidden truth buried beneath her calm exterior. Finally, he exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to carry the weight of years, and lowered himself into the chair. "They're not going to let this go," he said at last, his voice a low rumble, rough around the edges like gravel underfoot. Ayanna leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking faintly as she absorbed his words. She knew he was right, but hearing it aloud made the reality sink deeper into her bones. Marcus ran a hand over his face, the lines etched there deepening as he rubbed at the stubble on his jaw. "You don't understand, Ayanna. Bryant isn't just some cop who slipped up. He's one of them, crafted in their mold, shielded by their hands. And you didn't just break him, you broke their mirror." Her fingers drummed a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished wood of her desk, each tap a quiet defiance. "So, are you here to warn me, Marcus, or to convince me to step back?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto his, daring him to reveal his true intent. He met her stare, unflinching, and the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. "I'm here to tell you I've been in this game for 22 years, he replied, his tone heavy with the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too much. "I've watched how this machine operates. They'll cut Bryant loose in public, make a show of it, wave their hands and say they're cleaning house. But behind closed doors, they're already weaving the threads to ensure this never happens again." Ayana's gaze narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line as she leaned forward slightly. "By turning me into the scapegoat." It wasn't a question, but a statement, cold and certain. Marcus nodded, a single grim dip of his chin. "By painting you as the problem, the loose cannon, the judge who dared to step out of line." She let out a slow breath, the sound barely audible as it slipped past her lips and sat back again, feeling the weight of his words settle like a stone in her chest. "So what's next?" she asked, her voice quieter now, though no less resolute. Marcus shook his head, his jaw tightening until the muscles there twitched. "They're digging. Internal investigations. Every ruling you've ever made on a case tied to law enforcement, they're pulling it apart. Looking for cracks, dirt, anything they can twist to bury you." She wasn't shocked by that. She'd expected as much. The system had teeth, and it knew how to bite. But what he said next sent a jolt through her, straightening her spine as if an electric current had surged up it. "They're going after the jury, too." Her brows shot up, disbelief flickering across her face. "The jury hasn't even been chosen yet." Marcus leaned in, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice dropping to a near whisper as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Exactly. They're making calls, having hushed little chats in back rooms, pulling strings to stack the deck. They want a jury that'll see Bryant as the tragic hero, a good man who stumbled, not a monster who abused his power." Anger flared in Ayana's chest, a molten heat that spread outward until it prickled beneath her skin. But she held it in, her face a mask of calm, her breathing steady despite the storm raging inside her. "So they're rigging it again," she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Tilting the scales in his favor, just like always." Marcus nodded again, his expression darkening. Ayana let the thought sink in, feeling it press against her ribs like a physical weight. This wasn't just about Bryant anymore. The system wasn't merely shielding one of its own, it was shielding itself. Bryant's fall wasn't just a crack in the facade. It was a fracture that threatened to bring the whole rotting structure crashing down. If one of their golden boys could be held accountable, then the myth of invincibility dissolved, and with it, the power they clung to so desperately. She drew a slow breath, leveling her gaze at Marcus. "Why tell me this?" He held her stare for a long moment, his eyes shadowed with something raw and unguarded. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to pull from the depths of his soul, and shook his head. "Because I'm tired," he admitted, his voice softer now, almost fragile. "I'm tired of seeing decent people crushed under the weight of this mess while the worst of us walk free. I'm tired of looking the other way, pretending I don't see the blood on the gears. Maybe I should have spoken up years ago. Maybe I should have fought harder before it came to this. But I can't undo what's done. All I can do now is make damn sure you know what's headed your way." Ayana studied him, her eyes tracing the lines of regret etched into his face. Then she nodded, a small, measured gesture. "Thank you." He let out a dry scoff, the sound sharp and brittle. "Don't thank me yet. I can't stop this train. Hell, I can't even slow it down. I'm just the guy yelling about the cliff ahead." Her lips pressed together, and she understood what he wasn't saying. Marcus was a good man. At least he wanted to be. But he was still bound by the badge he wore, tethered to the institution he'd served for decades. When push came to shove, could she trust him to stand with her against the tide? She wasn't sure. So she did what she'd always done. She steeled herself, preparing for the battle she knew was coming. The next 48 hours unfolded like a tempest, wild and unrelenting. The DA's office kept their distance. Their silence, a calculated move to avoid the stench of the scandal. The governor, after days of dodging, finally released a limp statement about faith in the judicial process, words so vague they might as well have been written in smoke. The police department, though, dug in their heels. Press leaks sprang up like weeds, carefully curated stories that painted Bryant as a dedicated officer who'd had a single lapse, a man of honor undone by one fleeting mistake. Some outlets turned their sights on Ayanna, branding her as a zealot, a judge too driven by passion to see reason. Others whispered about her temperament, questioning whether she was fit to wield the gavel. Then the threats began trickling in. Anonymous emails that glowed ominously on her screen. Voicemails left in the dead of night, their voices distorted but their message clear. Back off or else. None of it frightened her. Fear had long since burned out of her system, replaced by a simmering fury that fueled her every step. But the real shift, the moment she knew this fight was about to spiral into something vast and untamed, came late one night as she left the courthouse. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, her mind buzzing with strategies and contingencies. Her heels clicked against the pavement of the dimly lit parking lot, the sound sharp in the stillness. Then she felt it, a prickle at the nape of her neck, that primal instinct that whispers, "You're not alone." She slowed, her eyes scanning the shadows, and there it was, a black car parked across the street, its driver's window cracked just enough to reveal the faint ember of a cigarette glowing in the dark. Someone was watching, waiting. She didn't flinch, didn't let her pulse quicken or her stride falter. She simply unlocked her car, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled away, her hands steady on the wheel. But as the city lights blurred past her windshield, the truth crystallized. They weren't just out to ruin her career. They were probing her, testing her limits, daring her to push back. Her grip tightened, knuckles whitening against the leather. She'd spent her life chasing justice, clawing her way through a system built to keep people like her in check. Now, that fight had grown into something bigger, something that wasn't just about her, but about every soul who'd ever been silenced, every voice drowned out by the machine. If they thought they could intimidate her into surrender, they were in for a reckoning. The hum of the city faded behind the courthouse's thick walls, but inside the tension was a living thing, coiling around her as she sat at her desk, staring at the papers strewn before her, motions, accusations, smears, all designed to unravel her. She wouldn't break. Not now, not ever. A sharp knock cut through the silence, precise and insistent. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She could feel the weight of his presence before the door even opened.
"Come in,"
she said, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet. The door swung wide, and District Attorney Thomas Grayson stepped inside, his pristine suit gleaming under the fluorescent light, a walking monument to privilege, every stitch tailored to perfection. His face was a mask of neutrality, but his eyes betrayed the calculation beneath. He closed the door with deliberate care, letting the silence stretch as he adjusted his cufflinks, the gesture practiced and aloof. "You know why I'm here," he said at last, his tone smooth as polished stone. Ayanna leaned back, folding her arms. "Let me take a wild guess. The mayor's office wants to wash their hands of this mess, and you're here to nudge me into making it easy for them." Grayson sighed, a theatrical little sound, and stepped closer, his polished shoes silent against the carpet. "This isn't personal, Ayanna." She let out a short, cutting laugh, the sound ricocheting off the walls. "That's the problem, Thomas. It's always personal when it's someone like me, a black woman who won't bow." His expression tightened, a flicker of discomfort breaking through his composure, but he didn't contradict her. "You're being boxed in," he pressed, his voice firming. "I'm here to offer you a way out before this gets uglier." She tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "A way out?" He nodded, sliding a crisp, neatly typed document across her desk. "A statement. You stepped down from Bryant's case, voluntarily. Say you've reflected and decided it's best for the process. Clean, simple, done. Ayana stared at the paper, then back at him, her lips curling into a faint, dangerous smile. And what happens when I don't? Grayson's mask slipped, just for a moment, revealing the steel beneath. Then you're on your own. And trust me, Ayana, they'll make sure you feel every inch of that fall. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence grow, her mind racing as she weighed the stakes. This wasn't just about Bryant or even herself anymore. It was about the lesson etched into every move they made. Power protects itself, and justice bends beneath its weight. But she'd learned something too. Consequences cut both ways, and she was ready to wield them like a sword. The air in the room hung heavy, saturated with tension that clung to every surface like damp fog. Ayan's dark eyes traced the looping scrawl of ink on the paper before her, each word curling into something grotesque, something that churned her stomach with a mix of disgust and resolve. She let out a quiet murmur, barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fan. "I see," as she lifted her gaze to meet Grayson's. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. Grayson, perched on the edge of his chair, faltered for just a heartbeat. His fingers twitched against the armrest, betraying the calm he tried to project. "They let this go," he said at last, his tone measured but laced with urgency. "The pressure fades away, the headlines move on, and you walk out of this with your life still intact." His words were a lifeline, tossed to her with a mix of hope and desperation. Ayan didn't respond immediately. She studied him, her sharp eyes peeling back the layers of his carefully constructed facade. The faint lines etched into his forehead, the way his lips pressed into a thin line. She saw it all. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached for the document. Grayson's shoulders sagged ever so slightly, a flicker of relief crossing his face. He thought she'd bend, that she'd take the easy way out. But that fleeting moment of hope shattered when her fingers tightened around the paper and, with a swift, decisive tear, she ripped it in two. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Grayson flinched, a subtle jerk of his frame, before his expression hardened into something cold and unyielding. "You really want to fight this?" he asked, his voice low, edged with disbelief. Ayan didn't waver. She met his stare head-on, her own gaze steady as steel. "I'm not the one fighting," she replied, her tone calm but resolute, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. "They are." Grayson exhaled sharply through his nose, a frustrated huff, and dragged his hands across his temples as if he could knead away the headache she'd just given him. "You're making a mistake, Ayan," he warned, his voice dropping into a gravelly register. She rose from her seat, planting her palms firmly against the desk's polished surface, leaning forward just enough to close the distance between them. "No, Thomas," she said, her voice dipping low, unshaken and threaded with iron. "The mistake was thinking I'd back down." Grayson's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into themselves as if resisting the urge to grab something, anything, to steady himself. He stared at her, searching for a crack in her resolve, but found none. "They're not just coming for your job," he said finally, his words deliberate, heavy with warning. "They're coming for your career, your reputation, everything you've built." Ayan's lips parted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but then a slow, deliberate smile curved her mouth. "Good," she said, her voice ringing with defiance. "That means they're scared." Grayson shook his head, his patience splintering like dry wood. "You want to be a martyr, is that it?" he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut. Ayan's eyes narrowed, glinting with something fierce. "I want to be something they can't erase," she shot back. The silence that followed was suffocating, a thick, tangible thing that pressed against their chests. Grayson sighed, a sound that carried the weight of years of battles fought and lost. "You always were a stubborn one," he muttered, almost to himself. Ayan's smile returned, but it was devoid of warmth, a blade wrapped in velvet.
That's why I'm still here,
she said simply. He lingered for a moment longer, his expression a tangled mess of frustration and something unreadable, regret perhaps, or resignation. Then, without another word, he turned and strode out the door, his footsteps echoing faintly in the empty hallway. Ayan sank back into her chair, adrenaline coursing through her veins like wildfire. She'd made her choice, and there was no undoing it now. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in the dark, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. Every trap they might set, every lie they might spin, every way they could twist this to shield Jonathan Bryant, the man at the center of it all. Her thoughts raced, relentless, a storm she couldn't outrun. Then, at precisely 2:34 a.m., her phone buzzed against the nightstand, a sharp vibration that jolted her upright. Frowning, she reached for it, her pulse quickening as she saw the screen. A text from a blocked number. "Check your front porch." A shiver crawled down her spine, cold and unyielding. She hesitated, her breath catching, then swung her legs out of bed. Moving with the caution of someone expecting an ambush, she crept to the window and peeled back the curtain, just enough to peer into the night. Her stomach plummeted. There on the steps, bathed in the faint glow of a streetlight, sat a thick manila envelope. For a moment she stood frozen, her mind screaming at her to leave it, to pretend she hadn't seen it. But curiosity, or perhaps defiance, won out. She grabbed a hoodie, tugging it over her head as she padded downstairs, her bare feet silent against the hardwood. The night air hit her like a slap as she opened the door, still and unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made every rustle feel like a threat. She darted forward, snatched the envelope and cast a quick, wary glance around before retreating inside and locking the door with a trembling hand. In the dim light of the kitchen, she tore it open, her fingers stiff with tension. Out spilled a file, a thick, heavily redacted police report. At the top, a name. Jonathan Bryant. Her breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary gasp. As she scanned the pages, her heartbeat thundered in her ears, growing louder with every line. Complaints buried deep, reports of excessive force, fabricated evidence, brutality, all of it tied to Bryant. Her stomach twisted into knots, bile rising in her throat. Then she reached the final page, the one free of black ink, and her world tilted. A name stared back at her, her father's. The blood in her veins turned to ice, her breath shallow and ragged. When she was 12, her father had been accused of theft, an event that had shattered her family, her faith, her sense of justice. She'd spent years convincing herself it was a mistake, a glitch in a broken system. But now, here was proof. Bryant had been there, had orchestrated it, had ruined her father's life, and by extension hers. She gripped the papers so tightly her knuckles blanched, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a rage she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. Bryant, the untouchable titan who'd spent decades abusing his power, had crossed her path before, and she'd been too young, too powerless to fight back. Not anymore. If they thought she was a threat before, they were about to see what she was truly capable of. Days later, the courtroom buzzed with a restless, electric energy. Every seat was claimed, every inch of standing room packed with reporters scribbling furiously, legal analysts whispering predictions, and ordinary people who'd clawed their way in to witness history unfold. The air was thick with anticipation, pressing against Ayan's skin as she sat at the bench, her hands resting steady on the wood before her. Her face was a mask, calm, unreadable, but inside her heart pounded with the weight of what was at stake. She'd spent years in rooms like this, sifting through evidence, listening to pleas, seeking truth. But this was different. This wasn't just about one man's crimes. It was about a system that had shielded him, about proving that even the mighty could fall. Across the room, Jonathan Bryant sat at the defendant's table, his once imposing frame diminished. His shoulders slumped, his fists clenched tight in his lap, knuckles white against the dark fabric of his suit. The arrogance that had defined him, his shield, his weapon, had begun to crumble. His face was pale, his jaw locked, his eyes flicking nervously toward the jury every few seconds. He'd spent his life wielding power like a club, deciding who would rise and who would break. Now, stripped of his badge and his bravado, he was just a man, small, mortal, and very much afraid. The jury had been out for 5 grueling hours, each minute stretching into eternity. Then at 3:47 p.m., they returned. A ripple of sound swept through the crowd as the jurors filed in, their faces carefully blank. Ayan's eyes locked onto them, searching for a hint, a clue. She saw it in the set of their shoulders, the flicker in their gazes. The decision was made. The room fell silent, a hush so profound that every creak of a chair, every rustle of paper, felt like a gunshot. The foreman rose, unfolding a slip of paper with steady hands. He cleared his throat, casting a brief, pointed glance at Bryant before speaking. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jonathan Bryant, guilty on all counts." The words detonated through the room. A collective gasp erupted, followed by a wave of whispers, sobs, and relieved sighs. But Bryant didn't move. For a long, suspended moment, he sat statue still, his face blank, his body rejecting the reality crashing down around him. Then his breathing shifted, sharp, uneven, his shoulders heaving as denial gave way to panic. The bailiff stepped forward, but Bryant remained rooted, as if his mind still clung to the delusion that someone would intervene, that this couldn't be real. "Jonathan Bryant, please rise," the judge commanded, her voice firm. He didn't. Then, slowly, agonizingly, he dragged himself to his feet, his hands, once so sure, so powerful, hanging limp at his sides. In that moment, Ayan felt the weight of justice settle into place, not just for herself, but for her father, for every life Bryant had crushed under his heel. Power, when abused, carried consequences, and Bryant's reckoning had finally come. For Ayan, it was a lesson carved into her bones. The fight for what's right was never easy, but it was always worth it. On a crisp March day in 2025, the courtroom buzzed with a tense energy as Jonathan Bryant stood motionless, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of inevitability. The judge's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, delivering a sentence that echoed through the room like a thunderclap. 15 years in prison, no chance of parole for the first 10, no special privileges, no easy escapes. For the first time in his life, Jonathan, a man who had thrived on control, felt the suffocating grip of helplessness tighten around him. The bailiff stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the polished floor, and Ayanna, seated in the gallery, watched with a quiet intensity. Her dark eyes followed the glint of the handcuffs as they snapped shut around Jonathan's wrists. Those same cold, unyielding shackles he'd once wielded to dominate and terrorize others now bound him in an ironic twist of fate. The metal clicked into place, a sound that seemed to reverberate in his bones, locking him into a reality he could no longer bend to his will. Cameras whirred and flashed, their lenses capturing every fleeting detail. The slight clench of his jaw as he fought to maintain composure, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the flicker of raw panic dancing in his hazel eyes. He tilted his head just enough to catch Ayanna's gaze, and in that split second, a silent storm passed between them. She saw it all, the dawning horror, the bitter acceptance that his reign was over, that the power he'd clung to like a lifeline had slipped through his fingers forever. Her heart thudded in her chest, a mix of triumph and sorrow as the gavel slammed down with a final, resounding crack. The sound was a guillotine, severing Jonathan's old life from the one that now awaited him. He was escorted out through a side door, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffle, the clinking of his chains fading as he vanished from view. In an instant, the man who had spent years swaggering above the law was swallowed whole by its unrelenting force. Outside, the world was a chaotic symphony of noise and motion. Ayanna stepped onto the courthouse steps, the chilly wind tugging at her coat, and was immediately engulfed by the clamor. Reporters swarmed like bees, their shouted questions overlapping into a deafening roar, while protesters and supporters jostled against barricades. their chants rising and falling in waves. News vans clogged the street, their satellite dishes piercing the gray sky, and every camera swiveled to fix on her, the woman who had stood firm against a titan. The nation had been glued to this trial, holding its breath to see if justice, so often a distant promise, would finally show its face. Ayanna said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't need to. The verdict had roared loud enough, a testament etched in the annals of this moment. Justice had prevailed, not with fanfare, but with the quiet, unshakable weight of truth. Yet this wasn't just about Jonathan Bryant, nor was it merely the downfall of one corrupt officer. It was a reckoning for a system that had cradled him, nurtured his arrogance, and turned a blind eye to his sins. How many complaints had been buried in dusty files? How many voices had been smothered into silence? How many times had he sauntered away unscathed because the rules were sculpted to shield men like him? Jonathan hadn't just believed he was untouchable. He'd been forged that way, molded by a machine that prized power over principle. But power is a fleeting shadow, and when the brave few, like Ayanna, refused to bow, even the mightiest could crumble. Still, a gnawing question lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. How many more Jonathans roamed free, their hands still gripping the levers of authority, their abuses cloaked by the same broken system? This battle might be won, but the war stretched far beyond the horizon. Meanwhile, on a frigid winter night in Chicago, the city lay cloaked in an eerie stillness, its streets deserted under a sky thick with frost. Michael, a seasoned police officer with a weary soul, trudged home after a grueling shift, his breath puffing out in white clouds against the biting cold. The wind sliced through his heavy coat, chilling him to the marrow, but he welcomed the solitude after hours of chaos. The faint glow of streetlights painted the wet pavement in hues of amber, casting long, wavering shadows that danced with each step. His mind drifted, lost in the day's burdens, until a soft rustling snapped him back to the present. It came from a darkened alley, a sound so faint he nearly dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps a stray animal scavenging for scraps. But then, a second noise stopped him cold, the muffled, heart-wrenching sob of a child. Goosebumps prickled along his neck as dread coiled in his gut. Children? Here? At this hour? His instincts surged, propelling him toward the alley's mouth. The deeper he ventured, the weaker the light grew, swallowed by the oppressive dark. Then, beneath a dim, flickering bulb, he saw them, two tiny figures huddled beside a rusted trash can. Twin girls, no older than 6, their frail bodies trembling in the cold. The older one, Leah, knelt with her thin arms buried in the garbage, her movements deliberate yet desperate as she sifted through the refuse. Her sister, Lila, stood a step behind, clutching a tattered cloak to her chest, her wide, haunted eyes darting nervously. Both were skeletal, their cheekbones sharp against hollowed faces, their curly hair matted with grease and neglect. Their clothes hung in rags, stained and threadbare, their bare feet swollen and crimson from the icy ground. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. The older girl, Leah, clutched a moldy scrap of bread, lifting it to her nose with a mixture of hope and resignation. Her hands shook, not just from the cold, but from a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of days, perhaps weeks, of survival. Lila's gaze flickered between her sister and the shadows, as if she'd learned to expect danger at every turn. Michael's chest tightened, a flood of emotions crashing over him. Shock, anger, an aching pity he couldn't name. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle them, and softened his voice to a whisper. "Hey, kids. I'm a police officer. You don't have to be scared. I just want to help." Leah flinched at his words, yanking Lila back with a protective grip. "Stay away! We don't want to be caught!" she cried, her voice quivering with defiance and fear. Michael raised his hands, palms out, his heart pounding as he searched for the right words. "I'm not here to hurt you or take you away. I promise. You're hungry, aren't you?" Lila peeked up at Leah, her small voice barely audible. "Can we trust him, Leah?" Leah's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Michael with a wariness far beyond her years. But there was something in his steady gaze, warmth, sincerity, that chipped away at her defenses. After a long, tense silence, she gave a reluctant nod. From his coat pocket, Michael pulled a granola bar, a habit from long shifts, and set it gently on the ground. "Here, take this," he said, stepping back to give them space. Leah crept forward, her bony fingers trembling as she snatched it up. Instead of eating, she pressed it into Lila's hands, watching as her sister tore into it with ravenous bites. Leah stood guard, her posture rigid, her eyes still locked on Michael, less afraid now, but far from trusting. "I can take you somewhere safe," he offered, kneeling to her level. "A place where you won't be cold or hungry anymore." Leah hesitated, her small face a battlefield of doubt and longing.
"Officer," she whispered, "where would we go?"
Michael met her gaze, his voice steady as stone. "Somewhere you'll be cared for. Somewhere you won't have to fight to survive." In that moment, the alley seemed to hold its breath, the weight of their fragile trust hanging in the balance. For Michael, this was no longer just a chance encounter. It was a call to action, a spark that would ignite a journey of sacrifice and redemption. For Leah and Lila, it was the first glimmer of hope in a world that had forgotten them. And woven through it all was a lesson as old as time. Justice isn't just the fall of the mighty, but the lifting of the fallen, and the consequences of power misused can ripple far beyond the courtroom, touching lives in ways no one could foresee. The silence in the frigid Chicago night was shattered when Lila's voice, soft and trembling like a fragile breeze, broke through the stillness.
"We don't want to go back to the orphanage,"
she murmured, her words barely rising above a whisper. They sliced into Michael's chest with a sharp, unexpected pang, piercing deeper than he could have anticipated. He didn't know the full scope of the horrors these two girls had endured, but the raw fear etched into Lila's tone and the haunted look in her wide, glistening eyes told him enough. They had been wounded by a world that should have sheltered them. Without a second thought, Michael's instincts as a police officer kicked in. He fumbled for his radio, his gloved fingers clumsy in the cold, and called for an ambulance. As the distant wail of sirens began to echo through the empty streets, he guided the girls toward his patrol car, its engine still humming softly in the alley. The night was biting, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. Michael opened the back door of the car, ushering Leah and Lila inside. Their small frames shivered uncontrollably, their threadbare clothes offering little defense against the wind. He shrugged off his heavy coat, the one his mother had given him years ago, and draped it over their shoulders. It swallowed them, the fabric pooling around their frail bodies like a protective shield. Leah, the older of the two, peered up at him from beneath the oversized collar. Her voice, faint and raspy, slipped out. "Thank you, officer." Michael's lips curved into a warm smile, though inside, something unfamiliar stirred, a fierce, almost primal urge to shield them from whatever had left them so broken. It wasn't just duty anymore. It was something deeper, something that tugged at the core of who he was. When the ambulance arrived, its flashing red and blue lights painted the alley in eerie, shifting hues. Michael climbed in beside the girls, settling into the cramped space as the vehicle lurched forward. He reached for Leah's hand, her fingers icy and trembling in his grip. She clung to him, her thin wrist fragile as a bird's wing.
"I won't let anyone hurt you anymore,"
he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. "I promise." Neither girl responded, but their eyes, Leah's cautious and searching, Lila's wide and trusting, locked onto his. In that fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of hope ignite behind their guarded stares, a fragile ember fighting to stay alive. The ambulance barreled through Chicago's desolate streets, the city's towering buildings looming like silent sentinels under the moonless sky. Michael sat wedged between the sisters, Leah pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass, and Lila curled into his side, her tiny hands gripping his sleeve as if he were her lifeline. The hospital doors swung open with a hiss, and the medical team sprang into action. Nurses in crisp white uniforms whisked Leah and Lila away, their movements swift yet gentle, like dancers in a somber ballet. Michael trailed behind, his boots thudding against the polished floor, his eyes never straying from the girls. The sterile scent of antiseptic stung his nose, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Leah and Lila were settled into beds in the emergency room, their small bodies dwarfed by the starched sheets. A doctor approached, his face lined with fatigue but softened by compassion. He flipped through a chart, his voice low and measured. "The girls are in rough shape," he said, glancing up at Michael. "The older one, Leah, is severely malnourished and dehydrated. The younger one, Lila, isn't much better. Plus, she's got scratches and bruises, likely from rough living. They've been through hell." Michael's throat tightened, but he forced his voice to stay even. "They'll be okay, though, right?" The doctor's eyes met his, steady and reassuring. "We'll do everything we can. You got them here just in time. A few more days out there and—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of it hung in the air. Michael nodded, his mind reeling. He could still see them as he'd found them, two ghostly figures hunched by a dumpster, scavenging through trash with desperate, practiced hands. The image burned into his memory, a stark reminder of how cruelly the world could turn its back on the innocent. Through the glass window of the examination room, Michael watched as the nurses tended to the girls. Leah sat upright, her bony shoulders hunched, her gaze darting warily around the room. Lila, exhausted beyond measure, had succumbed to sleep, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. A nurse with kind eyes and a soft voice waved Michael inside. He stepped in quietly, his presence filling the small space. Leah's head turned toward him, her large brown eyes tracking his every move. She didn't speak, just watched, her silence heavy with unspoken questions. Michael pulled a chair close to her bed and sat, the metal creaking under his weight. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently, his tone coaxing. Leah's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "We're okay," she whispered, her voice so faint it nearly dissolved into the hum of the hospital machines. "It's just, we don't want to go back to the orphanage." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He could hear the dread woven into every syllable, a fear born from experiences he couldn't yet fathom. He took a slow, steadying breath, his resolve hardening. "I promise," he said, his voice firm yet tender. "I'll find a safe place for you. No one will hurt you anymore." Leah's eyes flicked up to his, shimmering with doubt but laced with a fragile thread of hope. "You promise?" she asked, her voice quivering like a leaf in the wind. "I promise," Michael replied, his gaze unwavering, his heart pounding with the weight of that vow. She didn't say more, just gave a small nod, a tentative sign that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe him. That night, Michael didn't leave their side. He stayed rooted by Leah's bed, his broad frame slouched in the chair, his eyes tracing her restless movements. Lila slept soundly across the room, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd found her. But Leah couldn't rest. She lay still, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers to questions too heavy for her young mind. Michael leaned closer, his voice a soft murmur in the dim light. "Are you okay, Leah?" She shook her head, her lips trembling. We don't want to bother you," she whispered. "If you take us, we'll be good. We won't cause trouble." The words stunned him, a dagger of sorrow twisting in his chest. That she could see herself as a burden, at her age, after all she'd been through, shattered something inside him. He reached for her hand, enveloping her cold, trembling fingers in his warm grip. "Leah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Lila are not a burden. I want to help you because you deserve it. You're not bothering anyone." For the first time, tears welled in Leah's eyes. They didn't fall loudly or dramatically. They slipped silently down her gaunt cheeks, tracing paths over her pale skin. Michael brushed them away with the pad of his thumb, a gesture so gentle it surprised even him. Inside, a fire roared, an unyielding determination to protect them, to right the wrongs that had been inflicted upon them by a system that had failed. All night he kept vigil. He watched Lila's steady breathing, her small chest rising and falling like a metronome of resilience. He studied Leah's every shift, every sigh, her quiet strength a testament to the battles she'd already fought. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one truth anchored him. His life had been irrevocably altered. When morning broke, soft light spilling through the hospital blinds, Leah stirred awake. Her eyes found Michael still there, his presence a constant in her uncertain world. He offered her a gentle smile, his tired face softening with kindness. And for the first time, Leah smiled back, a faint, fleeting curve of her lips. But to Michael, it was a sunrise breaking through an endless storm. As he stepped out of the hospital into the biting March wind, the weight of the night clung to him. His breath puffed in clouds, but the chill barely registered. His mind was consumed by Leah and Lila, two fragile souls now tethered to his protection. He stopped at a familiar coffee shop on his way home, the bell above the door jangling as he entered. The warmth of the place enveloped him, the rich scent of roasted beans a fleeting comfort. He ordered a black coffee, the barista's cheerful chatter fading into background noise as he sank into a seat by the window. His hands curled around the steaming mug, but his eyes drifted to the sparse traffic outside, unseeing. His thoughts churned. Leah's wary resilience, Lila's quiet trust, the injustice of their suffering. It gnawed at him, the realization that power, when misused or neglected, could crush the innocent beneath its heel. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with a steadying breath, he dialed Monica, his fiancée, his anchor. She picked up after a few rings, her voice bright and familiar. "Hey, you okay? You sound off?" Michael exhaled, the steam from his coffee curling upward. He thought of their plans, a house, a family, a stable life, and now this unexpected detour. "Monica," he began, his voice low but resolute, "I need to tell you about last night, about two girls who need us, and about a promise I made." As he spoke, he felt the gravity of justice settle into his bones, not the abstract kind he'd sworn to uphold as an officer, but the real, messy, human kind that demanded sacrifice. The consequences of power's abuse had scarred Leah and Lila, but Michael vowed they'd never face it alone again. The phone rang, slicing through the stillness of the early morning. Monica's voice came through the line, groggy and thick with sleep, as if she'd been dragged reluctantly from a dream. "Michael, where are you? I thought you'd be home by last night." Her words carried a faint edge of worry, softened by the haze of exhaustion. On the other end, Michael sat slumped in a stiff hospital chair, the sterile hum of the building buzzing faintly around him. He exhaled slowly, his breath heavy with the weight of the night, and began to unravel the story that had kept him away. He started from the beginning, his voice low and deliberate, as though each detail needed space to breathe. He described the moment he'd found them. Two small girls, Leah and Lila, huddled together inside a rusted trash can on the edge of town. Their frail bodies were swallowed by oversized, tattered clothes, their faces smudged with dirt and fear. The sight had hit him like a punch to the gut, a visceral ache that refused to let go. He told Monica how he'd scooped them up, their trembling forms barely registering his presence, and rushed them to the hospital. All night, he'd stayed by their bedsides, the rhythmic beeping of monitors filling the silence as he listened to their halting, whispered stories. Of abandonment, of cruelty, of a world that had turned its back on them. His throat tightened as he spoke, the memory of their fragile voices carving itself into his soul. There was a long pause when he finished, the line crackling faintly with unspoken tension. Monica didn't respond right away, and Michael could almost picture her, curled up in their bed, her brow furrowed, wrestling with the weight of what he'd just laid bare. Finally, her voice broke through, soft but steady. "I know this hurts you, Michael. I can hear it. But you did the right thing. You got them to the hospital. The doctors, the social workers, they'll take it from here. Her tone was reassuring, practical, the kind of logic she always leaned on when emotions threatened to overwhelm them both. Michael leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and closed his eyes. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, a harsh contrast to the darkness behind his lids. Monica was right in a way. Procedure would kick in, the system would churn forward, but deep inside, a restless fire burned, unsatisfied by her tidy resolution. "Monica," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "it's not enough." He paused, letting the words settle, then pressed on. "I think I want to adopt them." The statement landed like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile calm between them. Monica's breath hitched audibly. "What did you just say?" Her voice wavered, caught somewhere between disbelief and a dawning panic. Michael straightened, repeating himself with a clarity that surprised even him. "I want to adopt Leah and Lila. They have no one, Monica. I can't let them drift back to the streets or get lost in some orphanage." His words were firm now, resolute, as if saying them aloud had solidified a decision he'd only half understood until that moment. The line went cold, Monica's silence stretching into something sharp and brittle. When she finally spoke, her tone had turned icy, each syllable clipped with barely restrained frustration. "Michael, do you even hear yourself? These are strangers, girls you stumbled across less than a day ago. We're not ready to be parents, let alone adopt. This is insane." Her words stung, laced with a practicality he couldn't argue against, yet they only fueled the quiet conviction growing inside him. "I know it sounds crazy," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady, "but there's something about them, Monica. A connection I can't explain. I feel like I have to do this." His hands clenched into fists, the weight of his own emotions pressing against his chest. He couldn't shake the image of Leah's wide, searching eyes or Lila's timid grip on that old teddy bear the nurse had given her. Monica let out a laugh, but it was hollow, bitter, devoid of warmth. "A connection? Michael, this isn't some feel-good movie. This is real life. Messy, complicated, expensive. Do you have any idea what adoption entails? The paperwork, the money, the time? We had plans, Michael. A house, a wedding, a family of our own. And now you want to throw it all away for two kids you met last night?" Her voice rose, cracking with a mix of anger and hurt, and Michael could feel the distance between them widening with every word. He fell silent, her accusations sinking into him like stones. She wasn't wrong to worry. Monica had always been the planner, the one who mapped out their future with careful precision. But she couldn't feel what he felt, the gnawing guilt, the unshakable certainty that Leah and Lila were his responsibility now. "I'm not throwing anything away," he said finally, his voice softer but no less firm. "They've been abandoned, hurt, left with nothing. I can't turn my back on them." Monica's exhale was sharp, a burst of frustration crackling through the phone. "What about me, Michael? What about us? I didn't sign up for this chaos. I don't want my life flipped upside down because you've decided to play the hero on a whim." Her words trembled with emotion, a plea wrapped in fury, and Michael felt them twist inside him like a blade. "This isn't a whim," he shot back, his restraint fraying. "I can't sleep, can't breathe, knowing I could have helped them and didn't. I won't leave them behind, Monica." His voice rose, raw and unfiltered, the dam of his emotions finally breaking. Her response came cold and cutting, slicing through the heat of his outburst. "I'm not sure I can stay with someone who puts strangers above us." The words landed hard, a quiet violence in their precision, and then there was nothing, just the faint hum of the line. Michael's heart thudded painfully in his chest, her ultimatum echoing in the silence. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, resigned. "I need time. I'll call you later." The click of the call ending felt final, a door slamming shut. He sat there, the phone still pressed to his ear, an emptiness settling over him like a fog. Monica's anger lingered in the air, heavy and justified, but beneath it, his resolve held firm. He knew what he had to do, even if it cost him everything. Leah and Lila weren't just a fleeting impulse. They were a call to something greater, a lesson in justice he couldn't ignore. To wield power, he thought, was to bear its consequences, and he refused to let his authority as an officer or as a man be a passive thing, unused when it mattered most. Later that afternoon, Michael pushed through the hospital doors, the antiseptic smell hitting him anew. His boots echoed on the linoleum as he made his way to the girls' room, his mind still reeling from the morning's fight. When he stepped inside, he saw them, Leah and Lila, perched on the edge of the bed, sharing a worn teddy bear Nurse Carla had scrounged up from the storage closet. Carla herself hovered nearby, a stout woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense air, scribbling notes on a clipboard. She glanced up at Michael, offering a small nod of recognition, her presence a quiet anchor in the room. Leah turned first, her dark hair falling across her face as her gaze locked onto him. A hesitant smile flickered across her lips, fragile but real.
"You're back,"
she said, her voice small yet tinged with a cautious hope that made Michael's chest ache. Lila, younger and shyer, peeked out from behind her sister, clutching the bear tighter. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, his broad frame softening as he met their eyes. "I promised I would be," he said, his tone warm and steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Leah studied him, her brown eyes wide and searching, as if testing the weight of his words. After a beat, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where will you take us? If you do, we won't be any trouble. We'll be good, I swear." Michael leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees, and looked at her with a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed. "You'll never be trouble to me, Leah. You deserve a home, a place where you're safe and loved. I want you to believe that." For the first time, Leah's smile broke free, unguarded and bright, and she nodded, a tiny gesture that sealed something unbreakable between them. In that moment, Michael knew he'd go to war for them, against Monica's doubts, the legal labyrinth, or anyone who dared stand in his way. This wasn't just about saving them, it was about justice, about the cost of power and the courage to wield it for those who had none. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the cracked blinds of Michael's cramped apartment, casting jagged stripes across the floor. He sat at his kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee cooling beside him, his laptop open to a maze of adoption websites. The night before lingered in his mind, Leah's smile, Lila's quiet trust, but so did Monica's parting words. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the screen, scrolling through endless forms and requirements, financial statements, home inspections, counseling sessions. Each step loomed like a mountain, steep and treacherous, but he scribbled notes with a steady hand, undaunted. Picking up the phone, he dialed social services, his voice deep and unwavering. "This is Michael Thompson. I'd like to start the process of adopting 2 girls." On the other end, a woman's voice answered, warm and professional. "Thank you for reaching out, Mr. Thompson. I'm Mrs. Peterson, your caseworker. Can you come in tomorrow afternoon to go over the details?" His pulse quickened, but he agreed without hesitation. This was the first thread in a long, tangled journey, and he was ready to pull it. The following day, Michael stepped into the social services office, a modest space with faded carpet and walls adorned with photos of smiling families. Behind the desk sat Mrs. Peterson, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes sharp yet softened by years of compassion. "Mr. Thompson, please, have a seat," she said, motioning to a chair across from her. He sat, his broad shoulders tense, feeling her gaze assess him like a judge weighing evidence. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "Adoption isn't a simple choice, especially in a case like yours. You're a single man, a police officer with a demanding job, taking on 2 girls you've just met. It's a lifelong commitment, financially, emotionally, practically. We'll need proof of stability, counseling, a full evaluation. Your career's risks and ours will be scrutinized. Have you thought this through?" Michael met her gaze, unflinching. "I have. Leah and Lila have no one. I won't let them fall through the cracks of a system that's failed them already. I know what's at stake, and I'm ready to face it." His voice carried a quiet steel, forged in the crucible of the past 2 days. Mrs. Peterson nodded slowly, a flicker of respect crossing her face. She'd seen men crumble under less, but here was one who understood power's true price and was willing to pay it. Michael sat in the dimly lit office, the weight of his decision pressing against his chest like a storm cloud ready to burst. Leah and Lila, 2 little girls who had known nothing but hardship, deserved more than the scraps life had thrown at them. He couldn't bear the thought of them enduring another day of pain, their small frames hunched against a world that had been relentlessly cruel. Mrs. Peterson, a middle-aged social worker with a kind but weary face, sat across from him, her pen scratching against the notebook as she nodded thoughtfully. "All right, Michael," she said, her voice steady yet tinged with the gravity of the process ahead. "We'll start the assessment. It's a long road, paperwork, interviews, home inspections, parenting classes. It's not going to be simple, but if you're truly committed, we'll stand by you every step of the way." Michael's jaw tightened with resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes," he replied, his voice low but unyielding, a promise carved into the air between them. In the days that followed, Michael threw himself into the adoption process with a fervor that surprised even him. Each form he filled out felt like a brick laid in the foundation of a new life, every signature a vow to the girls he'd come to care for so deeply. He sat through interviews with social workers, their questions probing into his past, his intentions, his ability to provide. He spoke from the heart, his words spilling out about the moment he first saw Leah and Lila, 2 fragile souls with eyes that held both fear and a flicker of hope. He couldn't explain the bond that had rooted itself in him that day. He only knew it was real, unshakable. One evening, after a grueling counseling session where he'd bared his soul to a stranger with a clipboard, his phone buzzed. It was Carla, the nurse who'd become a quiet guardian to the girls at the hospital. Her voice crackled through the line, warm but urgent. "Michael, the girls are improving every day. But Leah, she asked about you this morning. Wondered if you'd come back. I think they need to see you soon." His heart clenched, a sharp pang of longing and responsibility twisting inside him. Without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and sped toward the hospital, the city lights blurring past him like streaks of a dream. When he stepped into the sterile hospital room, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope. Leah sat cross-legged on her bed, her small hands wrapped around a worn teddy bear Carla had given her, its fur matted from countless nights of clinging. Lila, perched on the next bed, scribbled absently with a colored pencil, her brow furrowed in concentration. The moment Leah's eyes landed on him, a spark ignited in her gaze, chasing away the shadows that lingered there. "Uncle's back," she said, her voice a fragile melody of surprise and relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for this moment. Michael's lips curved into a soft smile as he lowered himself beside her bed, the linoleum cool beneath his knees. "I promised, didn't I? I'm not going anywhere." Leah studied him, her dark eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper but piercing in its clarity. "Do you really want to keep us, Uncle?" Michael reached for her hand, his larger one enveloping hers with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. "Yes, Leah," he said, his tone steady as stone. "I want you and Lila to have a real family. I'll fight for that with everything I've got." She didn't respond with words, but a faint nod and the first genuine smile he'd ever seen on her face spoke volumes, a quiet trust blooming between them. The adoption process wasn't just a battle of paperwork. It was a war against the whispers and judgments of the world around him. At the police station where Michael worked, the air grew thick with gossip. One afternoon, as he stepped into the break room for a cup of coffee, he overheard Daniel and Harris, 2 fellow officers, their voices dripping with skepticism. "I don't get it," Daniel muttered, leaning against the counter with a smirk. "Why's he taking on 2 kids? Guy's got enough on his plate already." Harris, flipping through a magazine, chimed in with a snort. And they're black girls, too. A white cop adopting them. Does he even realize how people are going to look at him? Michael's blood ran cold, but he strode into the room, his presence silencing their chatter like a thunderclap. His gaze, sharp as a blade, pinned them where they stood. "You got a problem with me trying to give those girls a chance?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Daniel fumbled, scratching at his neck nervously. "No, man, just wondering. It's a big move." Harris shrank back, saying nothing. Michael straightened, his tone cutting through the tension. "It's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be right. And I don't care who's got an opinion about it. I'm doing this." The room fell silent, the weight of his conviction hanging heavy in the air, a testament to the justice he sought not just for the girls, but against a society quick to judge. Despite the resistance, Michael pressed on, undeterred. Every day after his shift, he drove to the hospital, his truck rumbling into the parking lot as the sun dipped below the horizon. He'd sit with Leah and Lila, painting vivid pictures of the home he was building for them. A bunk bed with crisp cartoon-covered sheets, a shelf brimming with books about princesses and far-off lands, a corner stuffed with plush animals waiting to be claimed. One quiet evening, as the hospital lights buzzed faintly overhead, Leah reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly.
You promised you wouldn't leave, right?
She asked, her eyes wide with a trust so fragile it nearly broke him. Michael leaned down, his grip tightening around her hand as if anchoring her to him. "Never, Leah. I'll always be right here." In that moment, as her small hand rested in his, he felt the truth settle deep in his bones. This wasn't just about saving them. They were his family now, a bond forged in quiet promises and shared silences, and no obstacle, be it bureaucracy or bigotry, would tear that apart. 2 months into the process, a call from Mrs. Peterson jolted Michael from his routine. Her voice, usually clipped and professional, carried a rare warmth. "You've passed the initial approval, Michael. You can bring Leah and Lila home under temporary foster care. This is it, the last step before they're legally yours." His heart thudded wildly, a chaotic mix of elation and nerves swirling in his chest. This was real now. His life, once a solitary thread, was weaving into something bigger, something permanent. The day the girls were discharged, Michael arrived at the hospital with a handful of balloons bobbing behind him and 2 carefully chosen stuffed animals tucked under his arm, a floppy-eared bunny for Leah, a scruffy bear for Lila. Carla met him in the hallway, her eyes glistening with pride and a touch of sadness. "You did it, Michael," she said, her smile bittersweet. "Those girls, they've latched onto you like you're their whole world. You're going to be an amazing dad." He shook her hand, his throat too tight to manage more than a gruff, "Thank you, Carla. I'll make sure they're happy." Leah and Lila emerged from their room moments later, Leah clutching her sister's hand with a fierceness that spoke of years spent protecting her. When Leah's eyes found Michael, they lit up, though a tremor of doubt lingered in her voice. "Are we really going with you?" she asked, as if the words might shatter the moment. Michael knelt to her level, his voice soft but sure. "Not just with me, Leah. From now on, call me Dad. We're going home." She froze, her breath catching, then flung herself into his arms, her whisper muffled against his shoulder.
Thank you, Dad.
Lila, still wary, edged closer, her gaze softening as she clutched the bear he'd brought her, a tiny smile breaking through her guarded shell. The apartment Michael had poured his heart into awaited them, a sanctuary crafted from late nights and careful planning. The girls' room was a burst of color, a bunk bed draped in sheets with dancing cartoon characters, a play corner piled high with stuffed toys, a bookshelf groaning under the weight of fairy tales. When they stepped inside, Lila stopped dead, her wide eyes drinking in every detail as if it might vanish. Leah's silence was heavier, her gaze tracing the walls, the bed, the books, as though memorizing a dream she feared she'd wake from. After a long moment, Lila's voice broke the stillness, quivering with awe. "Is this our room?" Michael nodded, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside them, This is your room? This is our home." Lila turned to Leah, then darted forward, wrapping her arms around Michael's legs.
"I've never had a room like this,"
she murmured, her voice fading into a soft sob. Leah stepped closer, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears.
"Dad,"
she said quietly,
"do you really want to keep us?"
He rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't just want to keep you, Leah. I want you to be my family. Forever." Those first days at home were a fragile dance of adjustment. Leah and Lila carried the weight of their past like shadows they couldn't shake. Lila would jolt awake at night, her cries slicing through the quiet, calling for her sister in a panic. Michael would stumble from his room, bleary-eyed but tender, sitting by her side with a lullaby he barely remembered or just holding her hand until her breathing steadied. Leah, though tougher, had her own battles, moments where she'd retreat to a corner, her knees pulled tight to her chest, eyes clouded with a fear she couldn't name. One night, Michael found her there, hidden behind the couch, her small form trembling. He didn't push, just sat beside her in silence until she finally whispered, "What if this doesn't last?" His heart ached at the question, at the lesson life had taught her, that good things could be snatched away. "It will last," he said firmly, pulling her close. "I'll make sure of it." Through it all, Michael saw the deeper truth unfolding. This wasn't just about giving Leah and Lila a home. It was about justice, about righting the wrongs of a world that had let them suffer. And it was about the consequences of power, the kind he wielded as a man, a cop, a father. To abuse it would be to destroy them. To use it well would be to build something unbreakable. As he watched the girls slowly unfurl, Lila's laughter echoing through the apartment, Leah's quiet smiles growing bolder, he knew this fight, this family, was his redemption, his purpose, his everything. Under the soft glow of a flickering bedside lamp, Michael noticed a few dry breadcrumbs scattered beneath Leah's pillow, a faint trail of her quiet fears. He knelt beside her bed, his voice tender as he asked, "Leah, why do you keep these here?" Her response came weakly, almost swallowed by the stillness of the room.
"What if there's no food tomorrow?"
she murmured, her eyes darting away, shadowed by a past that still clung to her like a stubborn fog. Michael's heart tightened. He placed a steady hand on her small shoulder, feeling the weight of her uncertainty beneath his palm. "Leah," he said, his tone firm yet warm, "you don't have to carry that worry anymore. I promise you this. Our home will always have food. You'll never feel that hunger again." His words wrapped around her like a blanket, and though she only nodded faintly, a flicker of relief softened her tense features. From that night onward, Michael saw a shift. Leah's guarded glances began to melt into something resembling trust, a fragile but growing bond between them. Balancing his role as a father with the demands of his job as a police officer was no small feat. Michael's days were long, often pulling him from the house before the sun peeked over the horizon, leaving Leah and her younger sister, Lila, still tucked in their beds. The precinct was a world of sharp edges, gruff voices, the clatter of radios, and the endless hum of responsibility. Yet his mind lingered on the girls, their safety and care a constant undercurrent to his every move. To ensure they were never alone, he turned to Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman next door, whose gentle demeanor belied a lifetime of resilience. A retired nurse with silver hair and hands that moved with quiet purpose, she'd listened to Michael's story one crisp afternoon over a cup of tea, her eyes crinkling with empathy. "You're a remarkable father, Michael," she'd said, her voice steady but kind. "But no one can carry this load alone. I'll step in whenever you need me." And true to her word, she became a cornerstone for them, watching over Leah and Lila when duty called him away, teaching him small tricks like how to whip up peanut butter sandwiches with a drizzle of honey that made the girls' faces light up. With her support, Michael felt the knot of doubt in his chest loosen, his confidence as a father blooming amidst the chaos. Slowly, the girls began to unfurl from the tight coils of their past. Where fear had once reigned, curiosity and flickers of joy took root. One evening, Michael trudged home after a grueling shift, his boots heavy against the wooden porch. Inside, he found Leah perched at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration as she guided Lila's tiny hand across a sheet of paper. Lila, Leah spelled out, only for Lila to scribble Leah instead, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. Leah threw her head back and laughed, a bright, unrestrained sound that pierced the air. Michael froze in the doorway, his breath catching. It was the first time he'd heard such unguarded happiness spill from them since they'd entered his life. That night, as he tucked them into bed, he wove tales of enchanted forests and brave knights, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of their eager breaths. Other times, he shared snippets of his own childhood, memories of fishing with his father by a glassy lake, the air thick with summer. Leah and Lila hung on every word, their eyes gleaming in the lamplight, wide with wonder. One night, as the final story faded into silence, Leah's voice broke through the quiet.
Dad, she whispered, we never thought we'd have a home. Thank you for not leaving us.
Michael's chest swelled with emotion. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his smile trembling with the depth of their trust. No, Leah, he replied softly. I'm the one who should thank you. You've given my life a purpose I didn't know I was missing. Life with Leah and Lila was far from simple. The early days brimmed with small struggles, missed alarms, spilled milk, the exhaustion of stitching together a family from frayed threads. Yet those moments were stitched with golden threads of joy that Michael wouldn't trade for anything. His once silent house now thrummed with life, laughter bouncing off the walls, the clatter of tiny feet, the warmth of shared meals. He realized this was only the beginning of a journey he was fully prepared to embrace, because Leah and Lila weren't just his duty, they were his heart, his world, his future unfolding in real time. As months turned to years, the girls wove themselves deeper into the fabric of his life. The day he took them to the nearby preschool stood out as a milestone etched in vivid color. He rose before dawn, the kitchen bathed in the soft gray of early morning as he packed their lunchboxes with care. A ham sandwich for Leah, a cheese stick for Lila, and 2 little notes scribbled in his blocky handwriting. Dad is always proud of you. Standing at the school gates, Leah clutched Lila's hand with a fierceness that belied her own trembling fingers. Michael crouched down, his knees creaking, and met her gaze. Leah, you've got this, he said, his hand resting on her shoulder. I'll be right here when the bell rings. We'll go home together, okay? Her eyes searched his, a storm of fear and hope swirling within them. After a beat, she nodded.
Yes, Dad,
she whispered, then tugged Lila forward into the unknown, her small frame radiating determination. Michael watched them go, pride and worry tangling in his gut as their figures shrank into the bustling classroom, a new chapter unfolding before his eyes. The months that followed painted a picture of transformation. Leah and Lila shed their timid shells, stepping into brighter versions of themselves. Lila, once a quiet shadow, began to bloom, her voice bubbling with tales of playground friends and the thrill of her teacher taping her first crayon masterpiece to the wall. Leah grew steadier, a quiet maturity settling over her as she dusted the living room shelves or sliced apples for Lila's snack. Yet Michael saw the ghosts she still carried, her need to be perfect, as if one misstep might unravel their fragile peace. One evening, as she scrubbed dishes with a focus far too intense for a child, he called her over. Sitting beside her on the worn couch, he said, Leah, you don't have to get everything right. Just be you. That's more than enough for me. She stared at the floor, her silence stretching long and heavy. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked,
if we mess up, Dad, will you leave us?
The question hit him like a punch. He pulled her into his arms, his voice thick with feeling. Never, Leah. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. I love you exactly as you are. From that moment, A weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. Her smiles came easier, and sometimes she even let him braid her hair instead of insisting she could do it alone. At the police station, the whispers about Michael's choice to take in the girls faded, replaced by nods of respect. Sergeant O'Reilly, a grizzled man with a bark as rough as his weathered face, approached Michael's desk one afternoon. "Thompson," he said, his tone softer than usual, "I didn't think you had it in you, but you're a damn good father. Not many could pull this off." Michael gave a small nod, the validation settling into a corner of his soul he hadn't known was hungry for it. Challenges still loomed, late shifts, tight budgets, but he felt anchored, certain he was where he belonged. Then came the morning when social services called. The adoption papers were finalized. Leah and Lila were officially his daughters. That evening, their little home buzzed with a celebration. Mrs. Johnson brought her famous apple pie, a few colleagues clapped him on the back, and the girls twirled in new dresses, their laughter ringing like bells. Midway through, Leah stood, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Dad," she said, her eyes glistening, "we thought no one wanted us. Now we have a family and we're so thankful." Tears pricked Michael's eyes as he crossed the room, enveloping them in a hug that spoke what words couldn't. Years rolled by, and Michael guided Leah and Lila through life's milestones, teaching them to pedal wobbly bikes down the driveway, stirring pancake batter on lazy Sundays, cheering from the front row at Leah's school plays, and framing Lila's vibrant drawings. One night, sprawled across the couch, Leah glanced up at him. "Dad, do we ever wear you out?" she asked, half teasing, half serious. He chuckled, pulling them close. "You're my pride, my joy, my everything. I love you more than you'll ever know." They nestled against him, and in that embrace, Michael understood the full arc of their story. He hadn't just rescued them from a shadowed past, they'd rescued him, filling his days with hope and meaning he'd never sought before. Their journey stands as a vivid reminder that family isn't forged by blood, but by the quiet, fierce acts of love and sacrifice that bind souls together. From a bleak night in a forgotten alley to a home alive with warmth, Michael didn't merely save two lost girls. Leah and Lila gave him a purpose that reshaped his world. Their story whispers a deeper truth. Justice isn't just a gavel's strike, but the steady hand that lifts the fallen. And the consequences of power misused are the lives left broken in its wake. Michael became their light, proving that one heart's resolve can rewrite a future, a lesson that echoes far beyond their walls. In a world of shadows, a single act of compassion can spark a miracle, turning despair into a dawn worth waking for.